The air in the Salvation Creek saloon was thick with dust whiskey and cruelty. On the auction block, though they didn't call it that, stood a small figure, her entire head and face hidden beneath a coarse burlap sack. Bartholomew Sharp, the man who owned the town, sneered. "They say she's too ugly to marry." He boomed, his voice dripping with false charity. "But I shall take this creature and settle her father's debt." He strode forward, gripped the rough fabric and tore it away. The crowd gasped, but Sharp's smug laugh died in his throat. He stared, his face draining of all color. His heart didn't just stop, it shattered. Salvation Creek wasn't a town, it was a kingdom. And its king was Bartholomew, Bart Sharp. He'd arrived a decade prior, not with a prospecting pan, but with a ledger book and a smile as cold as a high desert winter. He didn't dig for gold, he dug for debt. He owned the bank, which meant he owned the mortgages on every ranch farm and storefront. He owned the mercantile setting the prices for flour and feed. And he owned the sheriff, a man named Brody, whose tin star was less a badge of office and more a receipt for services rendered. Sharp was a man of routines. He was also a man approaching 50 with a grand, empty house on the hill and no heir to inherit the empire he'd built on the bones of other men's dreams. This particular irritation had been growing, festering like a splinter under his nail. He needed a wife. Not for love, a concept Sharp found financially inefficient, but for legitimacy. For an heir. But the respectable families, the ones whose land he hadn't yet foreclosed on, guarded their daughters. They smiled at his dinners, but saw the wolf beneath the waistcoat. His reputation, whispered in husg-moneyed circles back east, was one of ruthless, devastating efficiency. This brought him to his current and most public problem: Jedediah Cole. Jedediah was a dirt scratcher, a homesteader with a small, wind-swept plot of land that was by some geological miracle rumored to sit atop a significant silver vein. Sharp didn't care about the rumor. He cared about the land, as it controlled a vital water pass. Jedediah predictably had fallen behind on his payments at Sharp's bank. The foreclosure was set. But Jedediah had a daughter. The town had never seen her. Not properly. Whispers fueled by the town's chief gossip, Mrs. Pratchett, painted a grim picture. A hag, she'd sniffed over the counter at the mercantile, scarred and twisted from some childhood ache. Hideous, another agreed. Jedediah keeps her hidden, he's so ashamed. The town, bored and cruel, had named her Sackhead Lydia. It was said she only left the homestead at night, and when she did, she wore a burlap sack to hide her monstrous face. For Sharp, this was not a problem. It was an opportunity. He strode into the Last Chance saloon, which he also owned, and banged his cane on the floor. The shoddy piano playing stopped. "Gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying over the coughs and clinking glasses. "You all know the unfortunate situation of Jedediah Cole, a bad farmer and a worse debtor." A few of Sharp's paid cronies laughed. "He owes the bank a sum he cannot possibly repay. His land is forfeit." Sharp paused, letting the silence hang. "But I am above all a charitable man." He let his gaze sweep the room. "I am also a man in need of a wife. The good Lord has not seen fit to bless Mr. Cole with a comely daughter. The girl Lydia is unfortunate. They say she is too ugly to marry." He smiled, a reptilian stretch of his thin lips. "I say no soul is beyond saving. I will take the girl. I will marry her. In return for this sacrifice, I will consider Jedediah Cole's debt null and void." The saloon was silent. It was a grotesque proposal, a public humiliation, dressed as salvation. He wasn't just taking the land. He was taking the man's daughter as a trophy of her own ugliness. He was demonstrating with brutal clarity that there was nothing in Salvation Creek he could not claim. "Sheriff Brody," Sharp barked. Brody, a portly man with a face like damp dough, startled. "Yes, Mr. Sharp. Fetch the girl and her father. Have them at the Mercantile Steps in 1 hour. We shall have a public viewing, a betrothal. I want the whole town to see my generosity." Brody swallowed his hand, twitching toward the brim of his hat. "Mr. Sharp, the girl, she wears a sack, sir. Then she shall wear it to her own betrothal." Sharp laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Let no one say I am a man fooled by appearances. Go now." As Brody scurried out, Sharp poured himself a whiskey. He looked at his reflection in the mirrored back bar. He was a king, and today he would acquire his queen. It didn't matter if she was a goblin. She would serve her purpose. She would be a living, breathing testament to the fact that Bartholomew Sharp always got what he wanted. The Cole homestead was barely a shack. It huddled against the wind, its wood siding bleached to the color of bone. Sheriff Brody and his young, silent Deputy Finn rode up dust, coating their boots. Jedediah Cole met them on the porch. He was a tall, gaunt man, his eyes holding a desperation so deep it looked like madness. "Sheriff," he nodded, his voice a dry rasp. "Jedediah," Brody said, unable to meet the man's gaze. He looked at the ground. "Mr. Sharp, he's made a proposition regarding your debt." "I know," Jedediah said. "The wind carries the news from town. Then you know, he's asked for Lydia. He's gonna marry her in return for the land." From the shadows of the cabin's interior, a third figure emerged. It was the girl. The town's rumors, it seemed, were true. She was slight-dressed in a faded calico dress that hung on her thin frame, and over her head, tied loosely at the neck with a bit of twine, was a rough burlap sack. 2 small, crude holes had been cut in it, but they revealed nothing but darkness within. Deputy Finn flinched. Brody just sighed. "Ma'am, you best come with us. Mr. Sharp is waiting. He wants this done public." Jedediah looked at the girl. His hands were shaking, but he placed one on her shoulder. It was a gesture of what reassurance, resignation. The girl, Lydia, simply nodded. She didn't speak. She hadn't spoken, the town said, in years. The walk back to town was a gauntlet of shame. Mrs. Pratchett and her friends were already lining the dusty main street. "There she is, sackhead Lydia," one of them shrieked, half laughing. "Look at it, he's really going to marry it. Maybe he'll keep the sack on." A small boy, emboldened by the adults, darted out and threw a clod of dirt, striking the girl on the shoulder. She didn't flinch. She just kept walking, her head held at an odd, rigid angle. Deputy Finn made a move toward the boy, but Brody put a hand on his arm. "Not our business, son. Just get him to the steps." Jedediah walked beside his daughter, his face a mask of stone. But if one looked closely as Deputy Finn did, they would see his hands weren't just shaking with fear. They were clenched into white-knuckled fists. They reached the Mercantile. Bartholomew Sharp stood on the top step, dressed in his Sunday best, a black frock coat, and a silk ascot. He looked like a preacher at a funeral. The entire town, it seemed, was crammed into the street. "Ah, the blushing bride!" Sharp bellowed, spreading his arms wide. Jedediah Cole stopped at the bottom of the steps. He looked up, his voice cracking but loud enough to carry. "Mr. Sharp, you do this. You take my daughter, and the debt is clear. My land is my own." As clear as this blue sky, Sharp proclaimed, beaming. "A receipt signed and sealed will be yours. Now bring her up. Let the town see the new Mrs. Bartholomew Sharp." Jedediah paused. He looked at Lydia. He gave a short, sharp nod, almost imperceptible. The girl in the sack moved. She ignored Jedediah's offered hand and walked up the 3 steps alone. She stopped directly in front of Sharp, a strange, small, sack-headed figure, challenging the giant of Salvation Creek. The crowd was electric, a buzzing, monstrous thing. They were thirsty for the reveal. They wanted to see the monster. They wanted to point and gasp and feel better about their own small, compromised lives. "My dear," Sharp said, his voice a grotesque parody of affection, "I believe it is time to unveil." He reached out his fingers, pinching the rough fabric. They called her too ugly to marry. He boomed, playing to his audience. "But I, Bartholomew Sharp, have a bigger heart than most." With a theatrical flourish, he gripped the sack. "Let us see the face of charity." He tore it away. The apathetic afternoon sun beat down, illuminating the figure on the steps. The crowd, which had been leaning in with vicious anticipation, let out a collective, horrified gasp. Mrs. Pratchett's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide, with a mixture of revulsion and sick satisfaction. The rumors had not been lies. They hadn't been enough. The right side of the girl's face was a ruin. A web of thick, silvery scar tissue pulled the corner of her eye down and her lip up into a permanent phantom grimace. The scar tissue was old, mottled, and ran from her temple, down her cheek, disappearing into the collar of her dress. It was the kind of wound left only by fire, violent and unforgiving. The other side of her face, however, was untouched. A smooth, pale cheek, a clear, sharp, intelligent blue eye, a perfectly formed brow. It was this contrast, the grotesque and the beautiful, that made the sight so jarring. Sharp, who had ripped the sack off, took an involuntary step back. His smug laugh died, replaced by a choking sound. His initial reaction was the same as the crowd's disgust. This was not the meek, homely bride he'd expected. This was a monster. "My God," he whispered, his lip curling. And then his world stopped. It wasn't the scar that held his gaze. It was what hung around her neck. Partially hidden by the collar of her dress, but glinting now in the sun, was a locket. It was small, tarnished silver, and hanging from a simple leather thong. It was old, but its design was unmistakable. A heron wings spread, taking flight. Sharp's blood did not just run cold, it turned to ice. His breath hitched. That locket. He knew that locket. He had seen it every day for 5 years, hanging around the neck of his partner. His partner, Gideon Ross. The man He forced his eyes up from the locket. He looked past the scar. He looked into her one good eye, the clear, sharp, intelligent blue eye. It was not the eye of a broken, witless farm girl. It was the eye of a hawk. It was an eye that held no fear, no shame, and no mercy. It was an eye that remembered. It was the eye of Gideon Ross. Bartholomew Sharp's heart, that shriveled practical organ, seized in his chest. A jolt of pure, undiluted terror, a feeling he had not experienced in 15 years, shot up his spine and exploded in his brain. This wasn't Lydia Cole. This was Eliana Ross, Gideon's little sister, the girl who was supposed to be dead, the girl who was supposed to have burned with her brother in the fire he set at the Silver Heron Ranch back in the Arizona Territory, the fire that had been the foundation of his entire fortune. "You," he breathed. The word was soundless, stolen by the sudden vacuum in his lungs. The girl, Eliana, did not speak. She simply held his gaze. And in front of the entire town of Salvation Creek, she smiled. It was a terrifying sight, the smile only engaging the left side of her face, while the scarred right side remained a frozen mask of judgment. The king of Salvation Creek had just unveiled his own executioner. The silence on the steps stretched for an agonizing 10 seconds. The crowd, misinterpreting Sharp's frozen horror for simple shock at the ugliness, began to murmur. "He's going to be sick. Poor man saddled with that." Sharp, drawing on reserves of self-preservation he'd honed over a lifetime of villainy, snapped into motion. He grabbed Eliana's arm, his fingers biting into her flesh like a vice. The sun is too much for her. He stammered, his voice unnaturally high. A private ceremony. Immediately. Inside. He half dragged her through the doors of the mercantile, shoving past a bewildered Sheriff Brody. "Clear the street!" he roared, his voice cracking. "The betrothal is done." He hauled her through the store, up the private staircase, to his opulent apartment above, and threw her inside, slamming and locking the heavy oak door behind them. He leaned against it, breathing heavily, his face slick with a terrified sweat. He tore at his ascot, his eyes wide and frantic. "It can't be! It can't be! You're dead! You're ashes!" Eliana Ross stood in the center of his lavish parlor, a stark, scarred figure against his velvet settees and mahogany tables. She calmly rubbed her arm where his fingers had bruised her. She looked around the room, taking in the wealth, the stolen luxury. Then she spoke, and her voice was not the rasp of a mute. It was clear, educated, and honed to a razor's edge. "Hello, Bartholomew." "No," he shrieked, holding his hands up. "This is a trick, a ghost. You burned. You were careless," she said, her voice terrifyingly calm. "You set the fire, yes. You shot Gideon as he tried to run. You locked me in the cellar thinking I would burn with the house. But you were in such a hurry to steal the deed." She took a step toward him. He flinched, scrambling backward. "You underestimated the cellar. It was built into the rock. The floorboards above me collapsed, but they shielded me. I was trapped for 2 days, breathing smoke, listening to the embers crackle. When I finally dug my way out, this," she gestured to her scarred face, "was my reward. A small price to pay." "What? What do you want?" he stammered. "Money. You want money. I have money." "I want what you took," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I want the silver heron. I want the years you stole. And I want the life you took. You came here alone." Sharp's mind was racing, the terror beginning to recede, replaced by a cold, calculating anger. He was Bartholomew Sharp. He had killed for this. He could kill again. "You're a fool, girl. You're in my house, in my town. You think that idiot, Jedediah Cole, can protect you?" Jedediah Cole. Eliana laughed, a short, cold sound. "Jedediah is a good man. The real Lydia Cole, his daughter, was a plain, kind girl. She wanted to be a teacher in San Francisco. I made that possible. I gave them enough money to disappear, to have a new life. In return, he gave me his name and his blessing. You planned this. The sack. The rumors. I fed the rumors myself through a hired woman in the next county. I wanted you to hear of the hideous girl. I knew your ego, Bartholomew. I knew you couldn't resist a charitable act that was also a public display of power. I knew you'd want to own the ugliest thing in the valley just to prove you could." Sharp was regaining his composure. He straightened his waistcoat, his eyes narrowing. "So you're here. You've had your little speech. What now? You've walked into the wolf's den, Eliana. And now the wolf is going to eat." He lunged for the fireplace, reaching for the heavy iron poker. He never made it. The door to the parlor, the one he had locked, suddenly swung open. Standing in the doorway was Deputy Finn. His face was no longer conflicted. It was cold steel. And in his hand was a revolving shotgun, its massive barrel aimed directly at Sharp's chest. "I wouldn't," Finn said, his voice level. Sharp froze. "Finn, what is this? Brody will have your badge. I'll have you hanged." "Sheriff Brody is indisposed," Finn said. "He's currently locked in his own drunk tank, sleeping off a bottle of whiskey Mrs. Pratchett's bar hand, kindly laced with laudanum." You're with her?" Sharp was incredulous. "He is," Eliana said, stepping beside Finn. as is Martha, your housekeeper, who has been passing me notes on your movements for 6 months. As is Jedediah, who you thought was a simpleton, but who has been documenting every shipment that leaves your foreclosed properties. My father was Sheriff Callan. Finn said, his voice tight with a lifetime of suppressed rage. The sheriff before Brody, the one who disappeared on a hunting trip the same week you filed the deed for the Silver Heron Ranch, which you'd somehow bought from a dead man. Sharp's face went white. He wasn't in a wolf's den. He was in a trap, and the jaws had just snapped shut. You can't win. Sharp spat his eyes darting between Eliana and Finn. You have no proof. It's my word, the word of the man who owns this town, against a scarred lunatic, a grieving boy, and a senile old farmer. Oh, we have proof, Bartholomew, Eliana said. She walked to his grand mahogany desk. We just have to find it. Find what? Sharp sneered. The deed, the original deed to the Silver Heron, I burned it the same night I burned your brother. You're a meticulous man, Bart, Eliana countered. A man obsessed with ledgers and legitimacy. You wouldn't destroy the one thing that gave you a legal claim, no matter how fraudulent. You'd hide it. A trophy. Proof that you won. She ran her hands along the underside of the desk. Finn kept the shotgun trained on Sharp. It's not in the desk, Finn said. Martha and I have searched the house. Every drawer, every floorboard. Nothing. Then it's in the bank, Eliana said, frustrated. No, Sharp said, and a small, cunning smile returned to his face. Too obvious. And you'll never find it. You've overplayed your hand, girl. Eliana looked at him at the glint of confidence in his eye. He's stalling. Why is he stalling? The 3:10 train. Finn said, his blood running cold. It's not just a passenger train. It connects to the main telegraph junction in Prescott. Eliana's eyes snapped to a small secondary wire running from the back of the house, separate from the main town telegraph line. A private line. To who? Sharp's smile widened. An associate, a man named Corvus. He and his security specialists are on retainer. I pay them a handsome sum to be ready. If I don't send an all-clear signal by 3 o'clock every day, they assume there's trouble. A private telegraph at the bank is set to send a specific alert if I miss my check-in. Finn checked his pocket watch. It's 2:40. They ride from the old garrison? Sharp gloated. They'll be here in an hour, and they don't ask questions, Miss Ross. They just shoot. Whatever proof you think you have will die with you. The dynamic shifted instantly. The trap was no longer for Sharp. It was for them. The bank, Eliana said, her mind racing. We have to get to the bank. Stop the signal. The safe must be there. My safe at the bank is a Chilton Mark IV, Sharp said, enjoying himself now. Imported from London. Not even a dynamite charge could open it in 20 minutes. And I have the only key. He tapped his breast pocket. Finn. Eliana ordered. Take him. We're going to the bank. You'll open it, Bartholomew, or I'll put a bullet in your knee and Finn will take the key from your corpse. You won't, Sharp sneered. You need me to open it. You're betting your life I'm not as ruthless as you are, Eliana whispered, her scarred face inches from his. It's a bad bet. They marched him out the back door down the alley. The town was still quiet, recovering from the bizarre betrothal. But as they approached the bank, a shot rang out. It wasn't aimed at them. It was Jedediah Cole, positioned on the roof of the Mercantile, firing his hunting rifle at the telegraph wire. He missed. A second shot, this one from the bank itself. One of Sharp's bank tellers, loyal to his pay, fired a pistol at Jedediah, forcing him to take cover. It seems my loyal employees are already on alert, Sharp mocked. The alarm is raised, Eliana. The clock is ticking. "Finn, get him inside!" Eliana yelled. Finn shoved Sharp toward the bank's front door. As he did, Sharp executed a move of desperate, brutal strength. He stomped down hard on Finn's instep-breaking bone and simultaneously drove his elbow back into the deputy's ribs. Finn crumpled, gasping, the shotgun clattering to the boardwalk. Sharp didn't run. He dove for the shotgun. "Bartholomew!" Eliana screamed. He raised the weapon, the massive twin barrels swinging toward her. His face was a mask of triumph. "The house always wins." A shot exploded through the street, not from the shotgun. Sharp froze. He looked down. A small dark circle was spreading on his white shirt. He looked up, his expression one of utter confusion. Standing 20 yards down the street, smoke curling from the barrel of her small-sleeve derringer, was Martha, the housekeeper. The quiet, grey-haired woman he hadn't given a second thought to in 5 years. Sharp looked at Eliana. "The ledger," he gurgled, a trickle of blood appearing at his lips. He collapsed onto the boardwalk, dead. Eliana rushed to Finn, who was clutching his ribs. "The key!" Eliana yelled frantically, patting down Sharp's pockets. She found it. A large, ornate brass key. She sprinted to the bank door, shoving the key in the lock. She looked at Finn's watch. 2:58. The telegraph inside the bank was already clattering. The alert was being sent. "No!" she whispered, bursting into the bank. The tellers scattered. She saw the telegraph machine on a side desk, its key tapping out the automated signal. Click, clack, click. Click, clack, click. SOS, SOS. She was too late. Corvus was coming. "Barricade the door," Eliana yelled to Finn, who limped in behind her, his face pale with pain. "Jedediah, get down here." The town, drawn by the gunshots, was emerging into the street, confused and terrified. They saw their benefactor Bartholomew Sharp lying dead on the boardwalk. They saw the sackhead girl and the deputy barricading themselves inside the bank. Sheriff Brody, having been released by a panicking townsperson, stumbled out of the jail, his head pounding. "What in tarnation? They've killed him!" Mrs. Pratchett shrieked, pointing at the bank. "The monster and the deputy. They've killed Mr. Sharp." A mob mentality began to build. "Lynch 'em!" someone yelled. "Finn!" Eliana said, ignoring the noise outside. "The vault! Now!" Finn, using his rifle as a crutch, limped to the back of the bank and hauled open the massive barred day gate. Eliana followed him into the small reinforced room. There against the back wall was the Chilton Mark IV. "He's dead, Eliana," Finn panted, leaning against the wall. "Whatever's in that safe, does it even matter? We're about to be torn apart by the town, and if they fail, Corvus's men will finish the job." "It matters," Eliana said, her hands shaking as she inserted the key. "It matters." She turned the key. A heavy thunk echoed in the vault. She gripped the large steel handle and pulled. The heavy, meticulously engineered door swung open with a hydraulic hiss. Eliana stared inside. It was almost empty. There were stacks of bank notes, a few bags of coin and several loan boxes. But there was no deed, no silver heron file, nothing. Just a single, large, black, leather-bound book. "The ledger," Eliana whispered, the same word Sharp had gurgled as he died. She grabbed it. It wasn't a bank ledger. It was a private one. She opened it. Bartholomew Sharp's meticulous looping script detailed everything. It started 15 years ago. Payment to G. Ross partner, Silver Heron claim. Followed by expense fire, kerosene 2 gallons, and acquisition deed SH Ranch. But it didn't stop there. It continued. Payment to J. Callan Sheriff for silence, followed a week later by expense 1, rifle 1, bullet removal of J. Callan. It was all there. The systematic bankrupting of Jedediah Cole. The bribes to Sheriff Brody, the payoffs to Mrs. Pratchett for spreading rumors, the extortion of the mayor, and most importantly. "Finn," Eliana said, her voice shaking with a cold, terrible fury. "Look at this." She pointed to a repeating entry once a month for 10 years. Payment to Corvus retainer $500. He wasn't just paying them for protection, Finn breathed, reading the notes. He was using them. They were his enforcers. They're the ones who ran the Hendersons off their land. They're the ones who killed my father. And this, Eliana said, turning the page, is the final entry, made this morning. Transfer of assets. In the event of my death, full control of Salvation Creek Bank and all associated properties is to be transferred to Mr. Corvus, as payment in full for services rendered. "My God," Finn said. He was going to give the whole town to a gang of murderers. The front door of the bank splintered. The mob led by Brody was breaking in. "Give it up, Finn," Brody yelled. "There's nowhere to go." "We're trapped," Finn said, raising his rifle. "No," Eliana said. She held the ledger to her chest. "We're not. They are." She walked out of the vault, past the counter, and stood in the center of the bank, the ledger held high. "Stop," she commanded. Her voice, clear and powerful, cut through the rage. The townsfolk who had just broken the door paused. "You're mourning the wrong man," Eliana yelled. "You're trying to lynch the wrong people." "She's a witch," Mrs. Pratchett screamed from the back. "A scarred demon. She killed him." "He's right," Sheriff Brody added, pointing his pistol. "She bewitched Deputy Finn. Deputy," Eliana said, not taking her eyes off Brody. "Who was Sheriff Callan?" "My father," Finn said, stepping up beside her. "And who," Eliana said, her voice dropping, "murdered him?" She flipped the ledger open. "Bartholomew Sharp." She read the entry aloud. The date, the amount, the cold, simple note, removal of J. Callan. The crowd went silent. Finn's grief, his quiet anger, was known to them all. "He killed my father," Finn stated, his voice breaking, "and he gave the badge to this coward." He pointed at Brody. Brody's face went white. "Lies, it's all lies, that's a trick." "Is it?" Eliana challenged. "Then what about this?" She read the entry on Jedediah Cole, the one detailing how Sharp had systematically poisoned his well and had his grain shipments lost to force him into default. Jedediah himself stood in the doorway, nodding grimly. She read the entry on Mrs. Pratchett. Payment $5 for spread of sackhead rumor. Ensure girl is fully isolated. Mrs. Pratchett turned ashen. The crowd turned on her, their expressions horrified. "He didn't just swindle you," Eliana cried. "He played you. He turned you against each other. He made you cruel. And now," her voice rose to a crescendo, "he has given everything you own to the men who are riding here to kill us all." She read the final entry, the one giving the town to Corvus. The rage of the mob didn't vanish. It simply turned. It redirected like a flash flood from Eliana to the dead man on the street and the cowering sheriff in the bank. He wouldn't," Brody stammered. At that exact moment, a lookout on the mercantile roof yelled the one word everyone dreaded. "Riders, dozen of 'em coming fast." Corvus was here. The lookout's cry was a knife in the back of the town. "Riders, dozen of 'em coming fast." The word Corvus, unspoken, hung in the air, thick and toxic. Panic absolute and primal seized the street. The mob, which moments before had been a single furious beast intent on a lynching, shattered into a dozen terrified individuals. Men who had been screaming for blood now simply screamed, scrambling for cover that didn't exist. They ran into alleys, tried to barge into locked shops, their unity gone. Inside, Eliana's voice, clear and sharp as a cavalry bugle, cut through the noise. She stood in the splintered doorway of the bank, unflinching. "Get in the bank. Now it's stone. It's the only cover we have." For a heartbeat, the running townsfolk froze, caught between the terror on the road and the command from the monster they'd come to kill. They looked at her, the scarred face, the burning eyes, the absolute lack of fear, and made their choice. She was no longer a witch. She was a general. "Jedediah," she commanded, pointing up. "The roof. You've got the high ground and the best rifle." The old farmer, his face grim, gave a single sharp nod and disappeared up the bank's side staircase. "Finn!" "The upstairs windows. You can cover both ends of the street." Finn, dragging his broken foot, used his shotgun as a crutch and hauled himself up the stairs, his face a white mask of pain and resolve. The townsfolk surged through the bank doors, a wave of desperate humanity. "Stack the furniture," Eliana ordered, pointing at the heavy oak desks. "Barricade those windows." Sheriff Brody Forgotten was the last one in. He didn't help. He dove behind the teller's counter, his hands over his head, weeping in a puddle of his own cowardice. The sound came then, not just gunshots, but a low rolling thunder that shook the bottles in the saloon across the street. The thunder of hooves unified, and fast. They thundered into town, a dozen riders moving as one. They were not cowboys. They were predators clad in black dusters, their faces hard, their eyes dead. Rifles were balanced on their saddles, and matching Navy revolvers were strapped low on their hips. They fanned out in the center of the street, a perfect practiced formation of death. Their leader, a tall man with a face like a hatchet, dismounted. This was Corvus. He moved with a snake's fluid arrogance, his spurs the only sound in the dead, silent town. He strode to the body of Bartholomew Sharp, lying in the dust. He looked down, not with shock, but with a cold, appraising interest. Then he smiled. "Looks like the boss is dead," he called out, his voice oily and loud, projecting to every hidden window. He nudged Sharp's expensive boot with his own. "Which, according to my contract, makes me the boss." He turned, spreading his arms wide to the silent town. "I'll be taking possession of the bank, and the town open up. It's time to meet your new landlord." Behind the barricade, one of the townsmen, a baker named Hobbs, was shaking. He has the contract," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Sharp's will. It's legal. We have to." "It's toilet paper," a voice snapped from the second-floor window. Corvus stopped. He looked up. Eliana Ross was leaning out of the shattered window, the afternoon sun catching the silver web of her scars. She held the heavy black ledger in one hand. Corvus studied her, his head tilting. His smile faded, replaced by a dark, intrigued recognition. Well, well. What have we here? I remember that face. From the fire. You're the Silver Heron girl. Sharp said he'd handled it. He handled nothing, Eliana called down her voice, ringing with contempt. And you're in charge of nothing. By the law. Corvus laughed, a harsh, barking sound. I am the law, little lady. Are you? Eliana shouted, holding the ledger high for all to see. This book says you're a murderer for hire. This book says you murdered Sheriff Callan. A gasp went up from the townsfolk inside the bank. Finn at the next window gripped his shotgun, his knuckles white. This book, Eliana continued, her voice rising to a crescendo, is the real law, and in this town, the penalty for murder is hanging. Corvus's smile was gone. You're crazy. That's just a book of words. And those men behind you, Eliana called out, sweeping her arm to point at the 11 mounted killers. Are they partners in your new property? Are they going to get rich with you? Or are they just hired help? She flipped a page in the ledger. Because this book also says, Bartholomew Sharp was paying you. She aimed her finger at Corvus, a retainer of $500 in gold a month, for 10 years. A low murmur went through the riders. That was a fortune. "But he was paying your men." Eliana's voice dropped, becoming a sharp conspiratorial weapon. 50. The air on the street changed. The 11 riders who had been relaxed and arrogant suddenly sat straighter in their saddles. They looked at each other. They looked at their boss. Their hands, which had been resting on their pommels, slowly drifted toward their holsters. $50, while he took 500. The math was simple, and it was brutal. "He's been pocketing 90% of your risk for 10 years, Eliana pressed, seeing the doubt she'd sown. "Are you really going to die here today for the man who was swindling you?" "Shut up!" Corvus roared, his face purple with rage. He saw his control, his entire authority dissolving. He pulled his pistol, not just to shoot, but to shatter the spell. "Kill 'em all. The bank is ours." He fired at the window. Eliana ducked back as the wooden frame exploded, sending splinters flying. The fight began. But it was not the siege Corvus had ordered. It was a mutiny. Before Corvus could fire a second time, 2 of his own men, enraged by the decade of theft, drew and fired at him. "You thieving bastard!" one of them screamed. Corvus, shocked, took a bullet high in the shoulder, spinning him around. He staggered, firing back wildly at his own men. From the roof, Jedediah's hunting rifle cracked a single definitive boom. One of the few men still loyal to Corvus toppled from his horse, dead, before he hit the ground. The street erupted. The townsfolk, emboldened by the chaos, shoved their rifles through the barricaded windows and opened fire. The mutinous riders, now fighting for their lives against their former comrades, used their horses for cover. It was a short, brutal, and deafening firefight. Bullets tore through wood and flesh. Horses screamed. In less than 2 minutes it was over. The thick, acrid smoke of gunpowder slowly cleared. Bodies lay in the street. Corvus, clutching his shattered shoulder, was the last man standing, surrounded by his own men and the citizens of Salvation Creek, all their guns trained on him. Eliana Ross walked out of the bank. The broken door swung open, and she stepped onto the boardwalk past the body of Bartholomew Sharp, not even giving him a glance. She stopped 10 feet from Corvus, the ledger still in her hand. "It's over," she said. Corvus, bleeding heavily into the dust, spat at her feet. "The Silver Heron girl." He gurgled, a bloody smile twisting his lips. "You should have stayed dead." "And you," Eliana said, "should have read the books." She turned from him and faced the crowd which was now creeping out from the bank guns, still raised. "This man," she pointed at Corvus. "And that one," she pointed at the cowering, weeping Sheriff Brody, "are accessories to the murder of Sheriff Callan. They are accessories to the fraud and extortion committed against every single person in this town." She looked at Finn, who had limped down the stairs and was standing beside her, his rifle still smoking. "Deputy Finn," Eliana said, her voice clear and formal, "I believe you have an arrest to make." Finn looked at the townsfolk, at the bodies at the dead center of his father's long, cold case. He strode over to Sheriff Brody, ripped the tin star from the man's trembling vest and pinned it to his own. The metal felt heavy. It felt right. He walked to Corvus and kicked the gun from his reach. "Corvus, you're under arrest for the murder of my father, Sheriff James Callan." Then he turned, grabbed Brody by the collar, and hauled him to his feet. "And you're under arrest for all of it." The reign of Bartholomew Sharp and the terror he had built was finally, truly over. The echoes of the final gunshot faded, replaced by an almost deafening silence. The dust settled on Main Street, revealing the cost of liberation, spent cartridges, shattered glass, and the bodies of men who had died for a dead man's greed. The townsfolk who had scrambled into the bank for protection now emerged one by one, blinking in the harsh afternoon light. They looked at the carnage at the body of Bartholomew Sharp, and then, as one, their gaze fell upon the woman standing on the bank steps. Eliana Ross stood tall, the black ledger held against her chest like a shield. Her face half-scarred was impossible to read. She was no longer Sackhead Lydia, the town monster. She was not the blushing bride of Sharp's cruel theatre. In the stunned, silent vacuum left by the collapse of power, she was the only authority left. Sheriff Finn, his face a mask of pained determination, limped over to Corvus, who was bleeding in the dirt. He bound the killer's hands, then moved to the weeping, pathetic form of Sheriff Brody, who had been hiding under a water trough. "It's over," Finn announced to the street, his voice raw. But he was looking at Eliana. It was, however, just beginning. The next days were not a blur. They were a meticulous, painful, and cleansing reconstruction. The saloon, once Sharp's den of influence, became the town's temporary courthouse. At its head, Eliana and Sheriff Finn sat at a large table, the ledger open between them. One by one, the people of Salvation Creek came forward. Jedediah Cole, his hands shaking, was the first. Eliana turned the ledger to his page, and with a thick black pen, drew a line through the fabricated debt. "Your land is yours, Mr. Cole," she said, her voice clear. It always was. The old farmer looked at the ink, then at her, and for the first time in a decade, the madness of desperation left his eyes. He simply wept. His head bowed. 2 days later, a survey team he hired, paid for by a town fund, Eliana started with the money in Sharp's vault, struck the load of silver he'd always known was there. The rumor which Sharp had used to fuel his greed was true. Jedediah Cole was not just free, he was overnight the wealthiest man in the valley. But his first act was not to build a mansion. It was to post a fund for the families of the Hendersons and any others run off by Sharp's tyranny. The Hendersons themselves were found a week later, living in a sod house, 2 counties over. When they rode back into Salvation Creek, they weren't met with whispers. They were met with hammers' nails, and a dozen men who in their own guilt helped rebuild their torched homestead in a single weekend. The town's judgment, now clear-eyed, was swift and cold. Mrs. Pratchett, her face a pinched mask of indignation, tried to open the mercantile for business as usual. She was met with a profound, terrifying silence. No one would buy from her. No one would speak to her. When she tried to berate Martha, the housekeeper, in the street, the small, quiet woman simply looked her in the eye and said, "We know who you are." Shamed and with her power as a gossip, now revealed as a pathetic paid-for weapon, Mrs. Pratchett sold the store to the town council for pennies on the dollar and left on the next stagecoach, vanishing into the west. Sheriff Finn oversaw the finality of the old regime. He personally escorted a shackled Corvus and a sniveling, disgraced Brody to the 4:00 train bound for the federal prison at Yuma. As the train's whistle blew, the entire town watched. It was the sound of a cage door finally swinging shut. That evening, Eliana Ross stood alone in the house on the hill. It was hers now, legally by the same ledger that had damned its owner. The velvet settees, the mahogany desk, the crystal decanters, all of it was hers. She could have been the new queen. She held the ledger, the very source of Sharp's power. She could have owned the bank, the saloon, the mortgages. She could have become everything she had fought to destroy. She walked to the window, looking down at the lights of the town. They seemed warmer, somehow. She remembered the cold cellar, the smell of smoke, the searing pain. She remembered her brother's laugh. She'd come here for revenge. But revenge felt as cold and empty as this house. What she had found, instead, was justice. And justice wasn't about ruling. It was about freeing. The next morning, She walked into the newly formed town council meeting in the saloon. She placed the ledger on the table. "I am restructuring the bank," she announced, "as a town cooperative. The profits will be shared by its depositors. You," she said, looking at the stunned faces, "are robbing yourselves no longer." She deeded the mercantile and the saloon to the council. She kept only two things. First, she signed the deed for the Silver Heron Ranch, her old home in Arizona, over to a federal land trust, ensuring no man could ever steal it or burn it again. And second, she kept the house on the hill. Not as a throne, but as a watchtower. That evening, as the sun bled purple and orange over the high desert cliffs, she stood on the porch. Sheriff Finn walked up the path, his leg in a splint, but his shoulders straight, his new badge gleaming. "Eliana." "Sheriff." She smiled, turning to him. "The last of Corvus's men were on that train," he said, his voice quiet. "It's really done. Brody Corvus, all of it." "Good," she said, breathing in the clean, cool air. Finn shuffled his feet, his gaze awkward. "The town council. They're holding a dinner at the saloon, a celebration. They want to thank you." He paused. They wanted to know. What should they call you? I mean, they don't know how to address you. Mayor Ross, Ms. Ross." Eliana was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the lights of Salvation Creek, a town reborn from the ashes, just as she had been. She unconsciously touched the scar on her face. It no longer felt like a brand of shame. It felt like a map of where she had been, a testament to the fire she had walked through, and a reminder of the strength it took to get here. "They called her Sackhead Lydia," she said, her voice soft, carrying on the breeze. "They called her hideous. They called her the monster. They called her too ugly to marry." She turned to Finn. Her one good eye was bright, and her smile, the one that engaged both the perfect and the scarred, was no longer terrifying. It was whole. It was beautiful. "Tell them," she said, "to call me Eliana. That's the story of Eliana Ross, the woman they tried to bury under shame, but who rose from the ashes to reclaim her life and free a town. Her story is a reminder that the world will always try to judge you by what it sees by your scars, by your station, or by the sack they try to put over your head. But true strength isn't about what you look like. It's about what you remember, what you fight for, and the cold, hard proof you keep in your ledger. If this story of justice and karma moved you, please don't keep it to yourself. The best stories are the ones that are shared. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to see that the truth will always come out, and be sure to subscribe to this channel. We have so many more stories to tell, and you won't want to miss a single one. Thank you for listening.